On the afternoon of November 16th, 1937, amidst the smoking ruins of the Steene brick factory in Ostend, Belgium, rescue workers discovered a horror that transcended the standard brutality of an air disaster. The Junkers Ju-52 had been reduced to a twisted skeleton of duralumin and ash, the result of a high-speed collision with a factory chimney. But it was not the wreckage itself that caused the seasoned fire chief to freeze in disbelief. Lying amidst the debris, directly beside the burned body of a young woman, was the body of a newborn baby boy. The child was naked, untouched by the worst of the flames, and utterly alone. He had no name, he was not listed on the flight manifest, and he had never drawn a breath of fresh air. The forensic realization that followed sent a shockwave through the royal houses of Europe. The woman had gone into labor and given birth in the very moment the plane was crashing. The woman at the center of this grotesque nightmare was Princess Cecilia of Greece and Denmark. She was 26 years old, radiantly beautiful, and the beloved older sister of Prince Philip, the future husband of Queen Elizabeth II. There is no tragedy in modern royal history that rivals the sheer physical and psychological terror of Cecilia's final moments. She had boarded the plane in Frankfurt, heavily pregnant with her fourth child, intending to fly to London for a family wedding. Instead, she found herself trapped in a metal coffin, plummeting through the Belgian fog. As the pilot fought a losing battle against the weather, attempting a desperate emergency landing, the stress and the drop in air pressure likely triggered immediate, violent labor. While the engines roared and the ground rushed up to meet them, Cecilia was not just facing death. She was fighting to bring life into a world that was already collapsing around her. She died in the act of childbirth, her final scream lost in the explosion that obliterated her family. This was not merely an accident. It was an annihilation. In a single blinding flash, 3 generations of the House of Hesse were wiped from the face of the earth. Alongside Cecilia died her husband, Grand Duke Georg Donatus, her mother-in-law, the Dowager Grand Duchess Eleanor, and her 2 young sons, Princes Ludwig and Alexander. But it is the image of the newborn, the ghost baby found in the wreckage, that turns this event from a historical footnote into a Gothic horror. It represents the ultimate cruelty of fate, a life beginning exactly when it ends, a mother's instinct persisting even as the fires of death consumed her. For the world, it was a sensational headline, but for the 16-year-old Prince Philip, waiting excitedly in London to welcome his favorite sister, it was the moment the universe broke. Cecilia had been the one constant in his fractured, exiled life. She was more of a mother to him than his own mother had been able to be. To learn that she had died in such a visceral, terrifying manner, birthing a nephew he would never know, forged a steel wall around Philip's heart that would never fully come down. This is the story of that woman, a princess born into the chaos of revolution, who lived through the poverty of exile, and who died in a tragedy so profound that it permanently altered the DNA of the modern British monarchy. If you were born a royal in the early 20th century, you were born onto a shifting tectonic plate. For hundreds of years, the families of Europe, the Coburgs, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Glücksburgs, had ruled as if by divine right. They were all related, a vast squabbling transcontinental family who called Queen Victoria grandmama and wrote letters to each other in bad English and French. But by the time Cecilia was growing up, that world was shattered. The First World War had taken the map of Europe and torn it to shreds. Emperors became woodchoppers. Kings became taxi drivers. The Romanovs had been butchered in a basement in Ekaterinburg. The Kaiser was in exile in Holland. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dust. Princess Cecilia entered this world not as a fairy tale princess safe in a tower, but as a refugee in waiting. She was born on June 22, 1911, at the Tatoi Palace, nestled in the pine-covered foothills of Mount Parnitha, just north of Athens. Her father was Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, a soldier prince with a monocle and a dry, cynical wit. Her mother was Princess Alice of Battenberg, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a woman of intense intelligence, profound deafness, and a complex mystical spirituality that would later see her diagnosed with schizophrenia. Cecilia was the third of 4 daughters. First came Margarita, then Theodora, then Cecilia, and finally Sophie. They were close in age, a tumble of dark hair and white muslin dresses, growing up in the sun-drenched gardens of Tatoi. But the sun was setting on the Greek monarchy. Greece in the early 20th century was a political volcano. The royal family was constantly being packed onto ships and sent away, only to be invited back a few years later. They were foreign monarchs of Danish and German blood, ruling a fiercely nationalistic Greek populace. The defining trauma of Cecilia's life, the event that would teach her that palaces are not safe places, happened when she was just 11 years old. It was 1922. The Greek army had suffered a catastrophic defeat in the Greco-Turkish War. The dream of a greater Greece had collapsed in the burning ruins of Smyrna. The army revolted. A military coup seized power in Athens, and they needed scapegoats. They came for Prince Andrew. Cecilia watched as her father was arrested and dragged away from their home. He was charged with treason and disobeying orders during the campaign in Asia Minor. The trial was a sham. The revolutionary firing squads were already busy. Politicians and generals were being lined up against walls and shot at dawn. For days, Princess Alice and her daughters lived in terror, waiting for the sound of the gunshot that would make them orphans. It was the British who saved them. King George V, alarmed that his cousin Andrea was about to be executed by a revolutionary tribunal, sent a Royal Navy cruiser, the HMS Calypso, to Athens. The British naval attaché, a man named Gerald Talbot, engaged in a high-stakes diplomatic bluff, essentially threatening to shell Athens if the prince was not released. The revolutionaries blinked. Prince Andrew was banished from Greece for life. The evacuation of the Greek royal family in December 1922 is one of the most poignant images of royal exile. There were no private jets, no luggages filled with gold. They left with what they could carry. The night they boarded the HMS Calypso, the sea was rough. Cecilia, her sisters, and her mother huddled in the officers' mess. And in a makeshift cot constructed from an orange crate padded with blankets, slept Cecilia's baby brother, a 1-year-old boy named Philip. This was the crucible of Cecilia's childhood. She learned early that titles mean nothing when the men with guns come. She learned that safety is an illusion, and she learned that the only thing you can truly rely on is family. The family landed in France, refugees with a crest but no cash. They settled in Saint-Cloud, a suburb of Paris, in a house loaned to them by Andrew's wealthy sister-in-law, Marie Bonaparte. It is hard for us today, obsessed with the crown and the wealth of the Windsors, to imagine the life of the Greek royals in Paris. They were the poor relations of Europe. Prince Andrew, traumatized by the war and the near execution, began to drift. He spent his days writing a book trying to justify his actions. In the war, drinking and frequenting the clubs of Paris, he was present but absent. Princess Alice, meanwhile, opened a charity shop to sell embroidery and Greek lace to make ends meet. The young princesses, Cecilia included, worked in the shop. Imagine walking into a small boutique in Paris in 1925 and being served by a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, who was politely wrapping a tablecloth for a few francs. Despite the hardship, or perhaps because of it, the four sisters and their little brother Philip became an incredibly tight unit, and among them, Cecilia shone the brightest. She was, by all accounts, the star of the family. While her sisters were pretty, Cecilia was beautiful. She had the classic Greek profile, dark, soulful eyes, and a tall, slender figure. But it was her temperament that set her apart. In a family prone to eccentricity and high drama, Cecilia was the calm center. She was maternal, organized, and deeply affectionate. She adored Philip. Being 10 years his senior, she was less of a sister and more of a second mother. When Princess Alice's mental health began to deteriorate in the late 1920s, when she began hearing voices and claiming to be in physical relationships with religious figures, it was Cecilia who tried to shield the young Philip from the frightening reality of their mother's descent. By 1930, the family had completely fractured. Princess Alice was forcibly institutionalized in a sanitarium in Switzerland, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Prince Andrew, unable to cope, closed the house in St. Cloud and moved to the French Riviera to live with his mistress. The four girls were essentially homeless, relying on relatives, and Philip was sent off to boarding school in England, a boy without a home to go back to for the holidays. It was a tragedy of separation. But for Cecilia, it was also the moment she had to grow up. She was 19 years old, effectively an orphan, with living parents, floating through the drawing rooms of her royal relatives. She needed security. She needed a home. And in the way of her class and her time, she knew that the only way to get it was to make a good marriage. Fate, which had been so cruel to the Greeks, seemed to smile on Cecilia in 1930. She caught the eye of Georg Donatus, the hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine. To the royal matchmakers, this was a dream pairing. The Hesses were German royalty of the highest order. They were ancient, wealthy, and cultured. Georg Donatus, known to the family as Don, was 24 years old, handsome, dashing, and kind. He was a reserve officer, a lover of aviation, and a man with a deep sense of duty. But this wasn't just a political alliance. By the surviving letters and diaries, we know that Cecilia and Don were genuinely, passionately in love. In a life defined by instability, Don offered Cecilia a rock. He offered her Wolfsgarten, a beautiful hunting lodge surrounded by deep forests, and the new palace in Darmstadt. He offered her a place where she wouldn't have to pack her bags in the middle of the night. Their wedding in Darmstadt in February 1931 was a glittering affair, a momentary resurrection of the pre-war splendor. Crowds lined the streets. The snow-covered city was decorated with flags. For a moment, the gloom of the Depression and the rising political tensions in Germany were forgotten. Cecilia looked breathtaking in satin and lace, a diamond tiara resting on her dark hair. Walking down the aisle, she wasn't the refugee girl from the orange crate ship anymore. She was the future Grand Duchess. The early years of her marriage were the happiest of her life. She took to her new role with natural grace. She gave birth to Prince Ludwig in 1931, Prince Alexander in 1933, and Princess Johanna in 1936. She was a devoted mother, often photographed playing with her boys in the gardens of Wolfsgarten, looking relaxed and radiant. But while Cecilia was building her domestic paradise, the world outside the castle walls was darkening rapidly. It was the 1930s in Germany. The Weimar Republic was dying. Unemployment was rampant, and a new chancellor named Adolf Hitler was screaming from the radios. The Hesses, like many German aristocratic families, found themselves in a difficult position. They were patriots, raised to serve the state. They were terrified of the communists, whom they viewed as the murderers of their Russian cousins. The Nazis, for all their vulgarity and violence, promised order. They promised to restore national pride. They promised to protect the traditional structures of Germany, or so the aristocracy deluded themselves into believing. In May 1937, both Georg Donatus and Cecilia joined the Nazi Party. This is the shadow that hangs over Cecilia's story. It is the uncomfortable truth that makes her tragedy complex. Were they fervent anti-Semites? There is no evidence of that in their personal correspondence. Were they convinced Nazis? It is unlikely. They were likely opportunists, or perhaps they were simply frightened people trying to swim with the tide rather than drown in it. They were trying to preserve their family, their estates, and their way of life in a totalitarian regime that demanded total conformity. They could not know that the party card in their pocket would not save them from the laws of physics. They could not know that the year 1937, which began with political compromise, would end in absolute catastrophe. As the autumn of 1937 approached, the House of Hesse was preparing for another wedding. Georg's younger brother Ludwig was engaged to Margaret Geddes, a British aristocrat. The wedding was set for November in London. It was to be a happy reunion. Philip would be there. Cecilia's mother Alice, now released from the asylum and living a quiet gray life, would be there. Cecilia was 8 months pregnant. Her doctors advised caution, but she was feeling well. She missed her brother Ludwig. She wanted to see Philip. She wanted to go to London. On the morning of November 16th, the mist was rising off the fields around the Frankfurt airfield. The black Junkers Ju-52 was waiting on the tarmac, its propellers idle. The pilots, Tony Martins and his crew, were checking the instruments. Cecilia kissed her little daughter, Johanna, goodbye, leaving her in the care of a nurse. She climbed into the aircraft, settling into the leather seat. The engines coughed into life. The plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the gray German sky, banking west towards Belgium, towards the fog, towards the chimney, towards the end. As the Junkers Ju-52 disappeared into the clouds, the clock began to tick down on the House of Hesse. In London, a young Prince Philip was checking his suit for the wedding, expecting to see his beloved sister in a few hours. He did not know that he was about to become the principal mourner in a tragedy that would stun the world. He did not know that the sister who had practically raised him was already flying towards her grave. The sky over Europe in November 1937 was not a welcoming place. As the black Junkers Ju-52 droned westward from Frankfurt, leaving the safety of the German heartland behind, the weather began to turn against them. In the cockpit, the pilot, Tony Martins, was a man of immense experience. He was an ace, a veteran who knew the temperamental moods of the European skies. But even for a man like Martins, the wall of white that rose up to meet them over Belgium must have been unsettling. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was likely a mix of excitement and fatigue. Air travel in the 1930s was loud. The 3 BMW engines roared incessantly, vibrating through the floorboards and the leather seats. For a heavily pregnant woman like Princess Cecilia, it would have been physically exhausting. She was 8 months gone, her body swollen, her back likely aching from the vibration. But she was a woman of duty and deep familial love. The discomfort was a price she was willing to pay to see her favorite brother, Ludwig, marry the woman he loved. We can imagine the scene. Georg Donatus, Dawn, perhaps holding her hand, trying to shout reassuring words over the noise of the engines. The 2 little boys, Ludwig and Alexander, peering out of the small rectangular windows, watching the patchwork fields of Germany disappear beneath a blanket of gray wool. The Dowager Grand Duchess Eleanor, a woman who had seen the fall of the Russian Empire and the collapse of the German monarchy, sat with the stoicism of a generation that had learned to endure anything. They were scheduled to stop in Brussels. The flight plan was routine: land, refuel, pick up 2 more passengers, friends of the family, and continue across the Channel to London. But as they approached the Belgian capital, the radio crackled with bad news. Brussels was closed. The fog was too thick. Visibility was near zero. Martens had a choice. He could turn back to Frankfurt, he could circle and wait, or he could divert to the coast, hoping that the sea breeze had cleared the air over Ostend. He chose Ostend. It was a decision that would change history. As the plane banked towards the coast, something happened inside that cabin that transformed a difficult flight into a desperate medical emergency. We will never know the exact words spoken, but we can reconstruct the terror based on what happened next. Cecilia went into labor. Perhaps it was the drop in air pressure. Perhaps it was the stress of the turbulence. But miles above the Belgian fields, the princess began to experience the rhythmic, tearing pains of childbirth. Panic must have surged through the small cabin. There was no doctor on board. There were no medical supplies. Just a frantic husband, a terrified mother-in-law, and 2 confused little boys watching their mother in agony. Martens, up in the cockpit, would have been alerted immediately. The Grand Duchess was birthing. He couldn't circle anymore. He couldn't wait for a break in the weather. He had to get this plane on the ground now. At the Steene aerodrome near Ostend, the ground crew heard the engines before they saw the plane. The sound was wrong. It was too low, too aggressive. The pilot wasn't making a standard approach. He was practically diving, hunting for the ground. Witnesses at the nearby brick factory looked up and saw a shadow detach itself from the fog. The Junkers was coming in steep. Martens had dropped flares, desperate bursts of light trying to pierce the gloom, but the fog swallowed them up. He was flying blind, trusting his altimeter and his instincts, unaware that the factory chimney was rising up directly in his path like a stone sentinel. It happened in a heartbeat. The tip of the wing caught the chimney. The metal sheared with a scream that was audible over the engines. The plane, unbalanced and traveling at over 100 miles per hour, spun violently. It pirouetted through the mist, a broken toy, and slammed into the factory yard. The fuel tanks ruptured on impact. A fireball erupted, painting the gray fog with a sudden violent orange. The heat was so intense, it melted the glass in the factory windows. It was 2:47 p.m. The silence that followed must have been deafening. Then came the sirens. The local fire brigade rushed to the scene, their bells clanging, men shouting in Flemish and French. They fought the flames with hoses, desperate to find survivors. But as the water hit the burning fuselage, turning to steam, it became clear that there was no one to save. The intensity of the fire had turned the cabin into a crematorium. It was only when the flames died down and the smoke began to clear that the true horror of Ostend was revealed. The firefighters moved in to recover the bodies. They found Georg Donatus. They found his mother. They found the 2 little boys, huddled together in death as they had been in life. And then they found Cecilia. The discovery was so shocking that it made the hardened rescue workers recoil. Lying beside the burned body of the princess was the body of a newborn baby boy. The autopsy and investigation would later suggest the unthinkable. The baby had been born during the crash, or in the terrifying moments immediately preceding it. The pilot, Martens, hadn't just been battling the fog. He had been trying to land a flying ambulance. The child had entered the world at the exact moment his world was destroyed. He had no name. He had never felt the sun. He was the passenger who wasn't on the manifest, the ghost of the flight. This detail, the baby in the wreckage, was flashed across the telegraph wires of Europe. It added a layer of grotesque tragedy to the accident. It wasn't just a crash, it was a massacre of innocents. A mother, a father, a grandmother, 2 children, and a newborn. 3 generations of the House of Hesse wiped out in a single second. While the wreckage was still smoking in Ostend, Prince Ludwig was standing at Croydon Airport in London. He was the groom. He was happy. He was checking his watch, scanning the sky for the familiar silhouette of the Junkers. He was expecting his brother, his sister-in-law, and his favorite nephews to come walking down the steps laughing, bearing gifts. The plane was late. At first it was just a delay. Weather, they said, common enough in November. But as the hours ticked by, the atmosphere in the VIP lounge shifted. The staff began to whisper. A telephone rang in the office, shrill and demanding. The airport manager walked out, his face pale. Taking Prince Ludwig aside into a private room away from the prying eyes of the press, they delivered the blow. There had been an accident. There were no survivors. Imagine that moment, the collapse of the world. One minute you are getting married, the next you are the head of a family that no longer exists. Ludwig didn't just lose his guests, he became the Grand Duke of Hesse, and by Rhine in that instant. He inherited a title he never wanted, at the cost of the people he loved most. The news spread to the rest of the family. In Germany, the flags were lowered, but the most poignant reaction came from the young Prince Philip. Philip was at boarding school in Gordonstoun, Scotland. He was 16 years old, a tough, athletic, confident boy, but one whose life had been a series of abandonments. His father was gone, his mother was ill. Cecilia had been his anchor. She was the one who sent him hampers of food. She was the one he visited during the holidays. She was the one who made him feel like he belonged somewhere. When his headmaster, the eccentric and brilliant Kurt Hahn, called him into his study to tell him the news, Philip did not cry. He did not scream. In a reaction that would foreshadow the man he would become, he went silent. He absorbed the blow with a terrifying stoicism. But those who knew him said that something in his eyes shut down that day. The boyish light was extinguished, replaced by a guarded, steely resolve. He had learned the hardest lesson of all. Do not love too openly, for it can all be taken away. What happened next is one of the most surreal events in royal history. The wedding of Prince Ludwig to Margaret Geddes was scheduled for the following day. Most families would have canceled, but royalty operates on a different frequency. Duty comes before grief. Protocol overrides pain. They decided to go ahead with the wedding. It was a ceremony of ghosts. The venue was moved to a small private church. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. The guests, who had packed bright dresses and morning suits, wore black. The bride, Margaret, wore black. Prince Ludwig, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, stood at the altar like a man in a trance. They spoke their vows in hushed tones, the words, "Till death do us part," hanging heavy in the air, a cruel irony given the events of the previous day. Immediately after the ceremony, the honeymoon began, but they did not go to Paris or Venice. They went to the morgue in Ostend. The new Grand Duke and Duchess traveled to Belgium to identify the bodies. They had to look at the charred remains of their family to confirm that yes, this was Dawn, this was Cecilia, this was the baby. It was a descent into hell for a couple who had been married less than 24 hours. They then accompanied the coffins back to Germany. The train ride from Ostend to Darmstadt was a funeral procession on rails. At every station, crowds gathered silently to watch the train pass. The tragic story of the flying birth had captivated the public imagination. It was a Greek tragedy played out in modern dress. The funeral in Darmstadt took place a few days later, and it is here that the visual record of the event creates a jarring, uncomfortable collision of history. The streets of Darmstadt were packed. The Hesses were beloved in their city regardless of the changing politics. But by November 1937, the city and the country was under the iron grip of the Nazi Party. As the funeral procession wound its way through the cobbled streets toward the Rosenhöhe, the family burial ground, the route was lined not just with mourners, but with stormtroopers, men in brown shirts, men in black SS uniforms, swastika flags draping from the windows. Walking behind the coffins was Prince Philip. He was tall for his age, blond, looking incredibly like a young Viking. He wore a long, dark coat, his face set in a mask of grim determination. But look at the photos. Look closely at who is walking beside him. To his right, wearing a Luftwaffe uniform, was Prince Christopher of Hesse, a high-ranking Nazi. To his left were other relatives in Wehrmacht and SS regalia. The crowd gave the Nazi salute as the coffins passed. For years, this image was suppressed or ignored. How could the husband of the future Queen of England be surrounded by Nazis? But we must remember the context. Philip was a boy. He was grieving his sister. He had no control over who attended the funeral, and he had no control over the politics of his German relatives. He was walking through a nightmare, alone in a crowd of fanatics, burying the only mother figure he had left. It is said that Philip never spoke of this day, not to his children, not to his friends. It was sealed away in a vault in his memory. But looking back, we can see that this walk was the crucible. It was the moment he realized that he was truly on his own. The golden era of his childhood, represented by Cecilia, was buried in the cold earth of Darmstadt. The bodies were laid to rest in the family mausoleum. Cecilia, Georg Donatus, the two boys, and the unnamed baby. They were together in death as they had been in the sky. But as the earth fell onto the coffins, one loose thread remained, a thread that seemed to offer a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark of life amidst the overwhelming darkness. Back at the palace in Wolfsgarten, in a nursery filled with toys, sat the only member of the family who had not boarded the plane, Princess Johanna. She was 1 year old. She was an orphan now, the sole survivor of a doomed line. The new Grand Duke Ludwig and his wife Margaret, who had no children of their own, immediately adopted her. They poured all their love, all their grief, and all their hope into this little girl. She was the miracle. She was the proof that the Hesse curse could be broken, or so they thought. Fate, it seemed, was not yet finished with the House of Hesse. The tragedy of Ostend was only the first act. The shadow that had swallowed the parents was already lengthening to reach the child they left behind. The funeral was over. The crowds dispersed. The swastikas were taken down from the balconies. Prince Philip returned to school in Scotland, carrying a weight of grief that would make him old before his time. The world marched on, closer and closer to the brink of World War II. After the funerals were over, after the black crepe was taken down from the street lamps in Darmstadt, and after the soil had settled on the fresh graves in the Rosenhöhe, a terrible silence descended upon Wolfsgarten Castle. The grand hunting lodge, once filled with the laughter of Cecilia's 3 boys, was now a mausoleum of memories. But in one room, there was still life. Princess Johanna was 18 months old. She was the only member of the immediate family who had not boarded the plane to London. She was too young, the nanny had said. She would be safer at home. And so, by a twist of fate that feels almost cruel in its precision, she survived while her entire world was incinerated in the Belgian fog. For the new head of the family, Prince Ludwig, and his wife Margaret, Johanna was not just a niece. She was a lifeline. Ludwig had lost his brother, his sister-in-law, and his nephews. He was a man drowning in grief. Johanna became the raft he clung to. They adopted her immediately. Margaret, who had gone from a bride to a mourner to an adoptive mother in the span of 48 hours, poured a fierce, protective love into the child. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the Hesse curse had finally been broken. Johanna was a happy child, blonde and blue-eyed, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that had orphaned her. Photos from this time show Ludwig holding her, his face softening, the shadow of Ostend momentarily lifted by her smile. She was the promise of the future. She was the proof that life goes on. But the 1930s were not done with the House of Hesse. In the summer of 1939, just as the corn was ripening in the fields and the tanks were gathering on the Polish border, darkness returned to Wolfsgarten. Little Johanna fell ill. It started with a fever, a lethargy that wouldn't lift. The doctors were summoned. The diagnosis was meningitis. In an age before antibiotics could easily tame such infections, meningitis was a sentence of terror. Ludwig and Margaret watched helplessly as the child fought the swelling in her brain. They prayed. They bargained with God. They had already given so much to death, surely they would not be asked to give this last tiny scrap of life. God did not answer. On June 14, 1939, just 2 years after the plane crash, Princess Johanna died. She was 2.5 years old. The devastation was absolute. It was as if a cruel author had decided to erase the story completely. Cecilia, Georg, Ludwig, Alexander, the newborn baby, and now Johanna. They were all gone. The entire family unit that had posed so happily for photographs in the garden was wiped from the face of the earth in less than 24 months. Ludwig and Margaret were left alone in the silent castle. They would have no children of their own. The line of descent from Cecilia was extinguished. When they buried Johanna next to her parents in the park, they buried the last hope of the old world. And as they walked back from the grave, the air raid sirens began to test their wails over Germany. The personal apocalypse of the Hesse family was over. The apocalypse of the world was just beginning. While the Hesses were burying their dead in Darmstadt, the young Prince Philip was in England watching the storm clouds gather. The death of Johanna severed his last tangible link to his childhood. The nursery was empty. The sister who loved him was gone. He was 18 years old, a cadet at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, and he was about to face a dilemma that would have broken a lesser man. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war on Germany. For most young British men, the path was clear. You signed up, you fought the Nazis, you defended king and country. But for Philip, the water was muddied with blood. He was a prince of Greece, but his heritage was overwhelmingly German. His 4 sisters had all married German princes. Think of what this meant. The men he had grown up with, the brothers-in-law who had tousled his hair and taught him to shoot, the cousins he played with in the summers, they were now the enemy. His sister Sophie was married to Prince Christopher of Hesse, a committed Nazi and an officer in the SS. His sister Margarita was married to the Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, a German officer. His sister Theodora was married to the Margrave of Baden, another German officer. When Philip put on the blue uniform of the Royal Navy, he wasn't just fighting a nameless, faceless enemy. He was fighting his family. There were whispers in London, of course. There were always whispers. Is he loyal? Isn't he one of them? His brothers-in-law are Nazis. The xenophobia of wartime Britain was intense. A boy with the name Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg was naturally suspect. But Philip had one advantage. He had no home to go back to. Greece was neutral, then invaded. Germany was the enemy. England was the only door open to him. He threw himself into the war with a ferocity that silenced the doubters. He wasn't fighting for a political ideology. He was fighting for his own identity. He was fighting to prove he belonged somewhere. The war took Philip to the Mediterranean, the very sea his family had been exiled from. In March 1941, he was a midshipman on the battleship HMS Valiant. On the night of March 28th, the British fleet intercepted the Italian Navy off the coast of Greece near Cape Matapon. It was a pitch-black night. The ships were running silent, dark ghosts on the water. The battle that followed was a slaughter. The British battleships, using radar, a technology the Italians lacked, crept up on the enemy cruisers in the dark. When they opened fire, it was at point-blank range. The Italian ships Fiume and Zara were obliterated in minutes. Philip was manning the searchlights on the Valiant. His job was to illuminate the enemy ships so the gunners could tear them apart. Imagine the scene. The 18-year-old prince standing on the bridge, the smell of cordite and salt spray in his nose, shining a beam of blinding white light onto the screaming men of the Italian fleet. He was mentioned in dispatches for his bravery. He wrote later of the hellish scene, the ships exploding like volcanoes. But there is a deeper layer to this battle. The Italians were the allies of Germany. The men Philip was helping to kill were the allies of his sister's husbands. Across the continent, his German relatives were fighting their own wars. Prince Christopher, Sophie's husband, the man who had walked beside Philip at Cecilia's funeral in an SS uniform, would die in a plane crash in Italy in 1943. Another brother-in-law would be wounded on the Russian front. The family was bleeding on both sides of the line. Philip received no letters from Germany during the war. Communication was impossible. He spent 6 years in a vacuum, not knowing if his sisters were alive or dead, not knowing if the bombs he watched falling on German cities were killing the people he loved. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was a graveyard. The Third Reich, which Cecilia's husband had joined in a misguided attempt to save his heritage, had destroyed it instead. Philip, now a hardened naval lieutenant, returned to a Germany that looked like the surface of the moon. Cities were flattened, the people were starving, and the aristocracy, the class that had ruled for 1,000 years, was destitute. He went to find his sisters. The reunion was bittersweet. They had survived, but they had lost everything. Their castles were looted by American or Soviet troops. Their husbands were dead, imprisoned, or awaiting denazification trials. They were living in unheated rooms, cooking on camping stoves, terrified of the future. Sophie, the sister closest to him in age, had been widowed by the war. She was now a single mother, tainted by her husband's SS connection, living in poverty. When Philip arrived driving a Royal Navy Jeep, bearing gifts of coffee, Spam, and cigarettes, he must have looked like a creature from another planet. He was the victor. He was handsome, well-fed, and rising in the world. They were the vanquished, the pariahs. It was in this moment that the tragedy of Cecilia truly crystallized. If she had lived, if she had not stepped on that plane in 1937, she would have been here in the rubble too. She would have been 40 years old, perhaps a widow, perhaps stripping the velvet from the chairs to make coats for her children. The crash had spared her this humiliation. It had frozen her in time, as the beautiful, perfect princess, while her sisters were forced to live through the shame of the aftermath. As Philip prepared to marry Princess Elizabeth in 1947, the shadow of his German family loomed large. The British establishment was terrified. The war was fresh in everyone's mind. The public was not ready to see the future queen standing next to women whose husbands had worn the swastika. The order came down from the palace. None of Philip's sisters were to be invited to the wedding. It was a crushing blow. Philip was about to experience the greatest day of his life, marrying the woman he loved and securing his future, but he had to do it alone. His mother, Princess Alice, was invited, but only because she had spent the war in Athens sheltering a Jewish family from the Nazis. Her heroism gave her a pass. But Cecilia was dead, and the other three sisters were too German. So on November the 20th, 1947, as the bells of Westminster Abbey rang out and the world cheered, Philip stood at the altar. He was the Golden Prince, the war hero. But in the pews behind him, there was a void. The family that had raised him, the sisters who had nursed him, the memory of Cecilia, they were all excluded. He had to cut off his past to secure his future. He was the man who walked alone. But the story of Cecilia did not disappear. It went underground. It became the secret sadness behind the Duke of Edinburgh's public mask. He rarely spoke of her. How could he? How do you explain to a British public, hungry for simple heroes and villains, that you loved a woman who was a member of the Nazi Party, that your grief was for the enemy? The tragedy of Ostend became a locked room in the House of History. But locked rooms have a way of preserving things perfectly. The war was over. Philip was now the Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of the future queen. He had successfully crossed the chasm from an exiled prince to the heart of the British establishment. But the cost was the erasure of his German identity. For nearly 60 years, the story of Princess Cecilia lay buried under the heavy soil of history, much like the wreckage of the Junkers Jew 52 in the Belgian clay. After the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, Prince Philip became a global icon. He was the man who walked 2 paces behind the monarch, the Iron Duke, the modernizer of the monarchy. He was busy christening ships, opening parliaments, and managing the vast estates of the Windsors. To the public, he was British to the core, a naval hero who played polo and made occasional gaffes. His German past was neatly airbrushed away. The name Battenberg had been anglicized to Mountbatten during the First World War, and Philip had adopted it before his marriage. The complex web of Hesses, Hohenlohes, and Badens was deemed too confusing and perhaps too controversial for public consumption. The tragedy of 1937 became a footnote, a dark anecdote known only to royal biographers and historians. Philip himself maintained a wall of silence. He was a man of his generation, a generation that did not believe in therapy or public confessionals. You packed your troubles in your old kit bag, and you smiled, even if the smile was tight. He never spoke publicly about the baby found in the wreckage. He never spoke about the scream of engines that must have haunted his nightmares. But silence is not forgetting. Behind the palace walls, the Duke kept the memory alive in small private ways. In his study at Buckingham Palace, amidst the clutter of books and naval memorabilia, there were photographs, black and white images of a beautiful dark-haired woman laughing in the sun at Wolfsgarten, pictures of 3 little boys in lederhosen. He kept in touch with his surviving sisters, quietly visiting Germany over the years, away from the cameras. It was only as the 20th century drew to a close and the raw wounds of the Second World War began to heal into scars that the story of Cecilia began to re-emerge. And it re-emerged because Philip, in his old age, decided to break the silence. The turning point came in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Iron Curtain had fallen. Germany was reunified. The stigma of the war was fading, replaced by a desire to understand the complexities of the past. Prince Philip was now an old man. The sharp-edged naval officer had softened into a grandfather figure, and like many men in the winter of their lives, he began to look back. He made several private pilgrimages to Darmstadt, But unlike the terrified teenager of 1937, walking through a gauntlet of swastikas, the elderly Duke walked through a quiet, peaceful park. He visited the Rosenhöhe, the family cemetery where Cecilia, Georg, Donatus, and the children lay. Witnesses who saw him there, gardeners, local historians, spoke of a profound change in his demeanor. The public Prince Philip was often brusque and impatient. The private Philip, standing before the graves of his sister, was visibly moved. He would stand for a long time, staring at the stone cross that marked the resting place of the family that vanished. There is a particularly poignant detail about these visits. Philip was known to be an unsentimental man. He famously disliked fuss, but he ensured that the graves were maintained perfectly. He wanted the names to be readable. He wanted the flowers to be fresh. It was a final act of brotherly protection for the sister who had once protected him. In 2006, in a rare interview for a book about the royals and the Nazis, Prince Philip addressed the elephant in the room for the first time. He spoke about his family's connection to the Third Reich. His words were characteristically blunt, but they offered a window into the reality of the 1930s that few had seen before. He admitted that there was a lot of enthusiasm for the Nazis in the early days, that people saw Hitler as a solution to the chaos of the Weimar Republic. He acknowledged that his brothers-in-law had been part of the system, but he also defended his sister. He insisted that they were not evil people. They were people caught in a machine they didn't understand until it was too late. It was a very difficult time, he said. You have to understand the despair. It was a remarkable moment of candor. By refusing to disown his family, by refusing to apologize for loving them, Philip humanized them. He reminded the world that Cecilia wasn't just a Nazi princess or a statistic in a plane crash. She was a woman who laughed, who loved her children, and who made mistakes in a world where mistakes could be fatal. As the emotional dust settled, modern aviation historians began to look at the crash of 1937 with fresh eyes. With the benefit of modern meteorology and forensic science, the question that had always lingered was revisited. Why did the pilot try to land? For decades, the official line was simply fog. But looking at the flight logs and the pilot's record, the flying birth theory became the only logical explanation for the erratic behavior of the aircraft. Tony Martins was an ace. He had flown hundreds of hours in bad weather. The Junkers Ju-52 was a sturdy beast, capable of circling for hours. Ostend was not their destination. There was no mechanical reason to dive into a blind fog bank. The only variable that explains the desperation is the human one. The discovery of the newborn's body confirmed that a physiological crisis was unfolding in the cabin. Modern experts have reconstructed the likely scenario. Cecilia, stressed and battered by turbulence, goes into labor. The pain is excruciating. There is bleeding. The husband, Georg Donatus, screams for the pilot to land. Martins, hearing the panic, abandons protocol. The fog of war becomes literal. He prioritizes the medical emergency over aviation safety. It is a tragedy of good intentions. If they had been colder, if they had ignored the pain and flown on to a clear airport, they might have lived. But their humanity, the desperate need to help a birthing mother, killed them. It also raises a haunting what if. If the baby had been born safely on the ground, that child would have been a cousin to King Charles III. He would have been a part of the modern royal circle. Instead, he remains the ghost baby, the only royal ever born, and died in the span of a single flight. Today, if you go to Darmstadt, the Rosenhöhe is a beautiful, melancholic place. The graves of the Hesse family are set in a quiet corner, shaded by ancient trees. The inscription on the stone is simple. It lists the names and the dates. But the true monument to Cecilia is not in stone. It is in the DNA of the British monarchy. Prince Philip died in April 2021 at the age of 99. In the days following his death, the world looked back at his life. They saw the naval officer, the consort, the gaff-prone duke. But those who knew the history saw something else. They saw the boy who walked behind the coffins. They saw the man who had lost everyone he loved before he was 20. They saw the resilience that was forged in the fire of Ostend. Cecilia's death was the trauma that made Philip Philip. It taught him self-reliance. It taught him to wall off his emotions. It taught him that duty is the only shield against chaos. When you look at King Charles III or Prince William, you are seeing the descendants of a man shaped by this tragedy. The stoicism of the Windsors, that famous stiff upper lip, is in part a legacy of the Hesse crash. It is the lesson learned by a 16-year-old boy in 1937. The world is dangerous. People die. You must keep going. And what of Cecilia herself? She remains frozen in time, the eternal princess. She is the Princess Diana of the 1930s, beautiful, glamorous, tragic. But unlike Diana, her story was swallowed by the war. She is the lost princess, the phantom sister. Her life was a bridge between the Victorian era of empires and the modern era of tragedy. She saw the end of kings and the rise of dictators. She lived through revolution and exile, and she died in the most dramatic way possible, falling from the sky with her unborn child. The story of Princess Cecilia is not a fairy tale. There is no happy ending. There is no last-minute rescue. It is a story about the terrifying randomness of fate. It reminds us that history is not just a list of dates and battles. It is the story of families. It is the story of mothers screaming in pain, of fathers holding their children's hands as the ground rushes up to meet them. It is the story of the silence that follows the crash. Cecilia, Georg Donatus, Ludwig, Alexander, and the unnamed baby. They were here. They loved each other. They had plans for the future, and in 1 second in the gray fog of Ostend, they were gone. But as long as we tell their story, they are not forgotten. They are the ghosts who remind us to hold our loved ones a little closer. They remind us that happiness is fragile, like a plane in the mist, and that we must cherish the clear skies while we have them.